For this installment of Current Reflections on Leadership, we are joined by Lionel Bordeaux, president of Sinte Gleska University on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota, and the longest-serving college or university president in the United States. For nearly 50 years, President Bordeaux has led SGU, but he is also a founder of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, the American Indian College Fund, the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium, and Tribal College Journal. He has served as a tribal councilman for the Rosebud Sioux Nation and as chair of the White House Advisory Board on Tribal Colleges and Universities. Over his long career, President Bordeaux has been honored by numerous organizations and institutions, too many to name here, for his impeccable leadership, and in 2018 was inducted into the National Native American Hall of Fame. Some have called him the dean of the tribal college movement. Others have named him as one of the greatest Native leaders of modern times. For all who know him, he is a paragon of goodwill, solidarity, and wisdom. So it's an honor to have you here today, President Bordeaux, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We'd like to begin by just asking a simple yet complex question. What makes a good leader?
A leader is someone who leads by example by empowering the staff you work with. Secondly, a leader develops the proper institutional services and academic classes, leading to continued student enrollment and graduation. Third, a leader is able to keep the tribal nations support, and a leader is able to keep the tribal government's continued support, which is very important. They're the ones who charter us. Fifth, a leader is being a visionary, always thinking ahead where you need to go in the future. Sixth, a leader is able to keep personnel working together in a friendly environment. And seventh, a leader encourages creativity through flexibility and supervision and policy development. Eight, a leader works to keep strategic planning updated. Nine, a leader in daily decision-making is able to always keep that decision within the big picture surrounding the many services provided by the institution. And I guess a personal guide for me as a leader has been, be your own best friend. Don't depend upon anybody else, but really yourself when it comes to certain situations. And secondly, it's something I heard from Dr. Robert Russell, whose son Monty is the president at Janae College now. But he gave a talk one time at Black Hills State University, where I was a student, and his talk was about self-determination. This was back in 1961. And he said, if you don't remember a word of what I said, just remember 10 words, my title. If it is to be, it is up to me. And I've always utilized and depended upon those. So that concludes my my answer to your first question.
Okay, well, thanks. What are some of the best practices in leadership that you've learned over the years?
I suppose the most important is developing team involvement in the mission of the institution and getting people on the same page with you as you carry out these activities in line with this mission. That's the best practice that comes to my mind there.
Okay. How is leading a tribal college, would you say, different than leading other organizations or institutions?
Basically, the big difference is tribal colleges and universities are based upon a foundation of spirituality and sovereignty. these are, they maintain and they strengthen tribal cultural identity, environment, and history.
Okay. Over the years, what have been some of the greatest challenges for you as president of Sinte Gleska University?
The big one has been the limited resources and funding. The availability of proper personnel, facilities, transportation, food, and daycare. Things like technology and broadband, or the proper, the big tough one is we were conceived and developed during the self-determination era back in the late 60s and early 70s. And back then, there was a lot of spirituality and what have you that surrounded self-determination, and ownership was a big one. But with education, we didn't have that ownership. That was owned by the accreditation associations. So it's only proper that at some point in time, and this has taken a long time, but that we have our own proper institutional ownership through our own proper accreditation through tribal laws and spirituality. And then the other is working with and through tribal politics. That's always been a big one there. And then living and operating in a rural, impoverished reservation has always been a tough one when it comes to hiring and trying to go about what you need to do. And then difficulty in hiring for lack of housing, and sometimes the bad negative media news regarding your particular area. When you think you've got somebody hired, and then they get to read the local newspaper and they see that what they feel is domestic violence and drugs and alcohol, and they just they don't want to bring their children into that kind of a situation. And that's always been a tough one to address.
So the bad media views that you just mentioned, are you referring to like when people come to SGU to work? Is that what you're referencing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, has there been any recent cases of that that you could share with us, or?
No, not in particular. When we first started, we didn't know people we were trying to hire, but we pretty well have an idea now, the type of person, and, we've got a little more housing availability. We know some of the nearby towns that we can work with to try to provide housing. So you don't see that so much anymore, but certainly when we were starting out, or, starting a new college someplace by new leadership, that might be something that they need to be mindful of.
Yeah. Well, I guess that was, when you look back at the history of Tribal College Journal, and when you and the others founded this publication, that was partially your intent, right? Was to create a
Yes.
publication to show the great work that tribal colleges are doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we always thank the Tribal College Journal. They've done a remarkable job over the years.
Oh, well, thank you for that. On a broader scale, what are some of the challenges you've encountered as a leader of the tribal college movement?
The big one was trying to secure some type of a incoming on a regular basis funding for development and expansion. And not having the local dollars, the tax base of any kind, we were dependent upon our treaty and the legislative process in Washington. So we were able to mobilize and secure some type of a beginning movement when we created AHEC. And AHEC was able to, with 6 members at that time, able to go into Washington, D.C. and start looking at the prospect of creating legislation that would have congressional recognition and have some kind of authorization for funding for tribal colleges. That was a tough one. No one knew us. Frankly, some people didn't care for us, and it was really it was just a most difficult type of a beginning by somebody. They didn't know us, and we didn't know them. We didn't know the process. It was an education for us, and it unfortunately took a lot longer than it should have for something that was as simple and as beneficial and good as tribal colleges are. But it took us 6 years before Congress finally recognized us and was able to secure the Tribally Controlled Community College Assistance Act of 1978. But I always remember something in specifics that when we were told by the various committees, which we learned were really the powerhouse in D.C., that we had to have our own congressional support from our own delegation. And I remember when we talked to one of the gentlemen, we were told that he asked, why are you seeking this legislation when you have several institutions of higher learning in your state? And then he went on, he said, in fact, you're going about it the wrong way. You know, you Indians are good with your hands. Why not stick to the arts and crafts? If you really want to do something meaningful for those reservations, flood them with chicken coops and hog pens. That's your future. That was a tough one to to work with.
Yeah.
But you needed the support of this individual, and you, of course, tried to educate him as to why you were doing what you were doing. But nevertheless, that's kind of typical of some of the reaction. I remember one time one of the subcommittee chair people called our proposed legislation the worst piece of legislation that ever crossed his desk. So we had a kind of a difficult time trying to maneuver and make our way through the legislative process, and eventually, getting a bill in our name and in our favor. But like I said, it took 6 years, so that was a tough one. But the other difficult one was the difficulty in initially gaining recognition by major educational institutions. A lot of colleges, universities, especially in our own state here, really had a tough time accepting us. They felt that we were really intruding on something that they were doing, and that we were taking students from them. But it in time, it worked itself out. I don't know that it's fully, but we get along good with the institutions. Some better than others, but I think we've made a lot of headway in that area. That we show them that we're valid, we have quality, and sometimes exceed. The coursework that they have in our behalf, or the historic history of tribes or education or what have you. So we've done well there in getting them on our side there. But for a long time, it was they thought our courses were watered down for easy passing, and it was just kind of a tough scene. But I think we worked our way through that. But those were some big challenges that we encountered over time.
Yeah, I've heard that story about that man who said, I guess he was a South Dakota lawmaker, about the hog pens and chicken coops. And
Yeah.
I've always wondered, you as a leader, when you're sitting across from him and he said that, how did you respond or react to that? Or, I mean, that seems like such a incredible, situation. What was your response to that?
Well, we were not accustomed to that particular type of critique or insult, whatever. But when we went into D.C., we found out in a hurry that we had to be the teacher. And these legislators really were students of ours, kind of that kind of approach. They didn't know anything about us. I remember we had to talk to him with this one congressional person from another state who was a chairperson of the subcommittee. We knew his brother. His brother used to be Secretary of the Interior, and tribes worked with him. So we had to recruit him to talk to his own brother about what we meant when we said trust responsibility. He had no idea what that term meant and how it originated and what it stood for. So we had to take the former Secretary of the Interior to talk to his own brother, who was a congressperson, and inform him what trust responsibility and what the treaties meant and what have you. So there was always, an educational process with us. So that's what I kind of had to rely upon talking to our own legislator, was to try to inform him that, there's another approach to all this, and it's all under tribal law, and it's valid, it's been congressionally approved, and we have treaties, and education is mentioned in those treaties, and so we're utilizing that language to create our own tribal institutions of learning. And our people don't have the resources to go to college locally. I told him, that people like myself, it was a tough time going to college because you were broke and you didn't have a car to go home, and it was kind of a lonely deal. But having your own college in your own yard, you didn't have to have all that. You could live with your family and stay with your family and be with your friends and still go to school locally and get an education and become a taxpayer in time and what have you. So over a period of time, we were able to, get those type of people, I guess, kind of, on our side and be supportive. This particular individual I'm talking about, I remember we had graduation, and I used to chair or was the moderator of those graduations at that time. So I'm standing up there. We conclude our prayer and our drum, honor song, whatever, all. And here comes a car, pulls up. And lo and behold, who gets out of that car but this individual? And he's walking towards, where the crowd is sitting. So I'm surprised, but I'm very happy. And so I introduce him, and I call him on up to stage and introduce him. And in the end, he become a supporter, a tremendous supporter, once he knew who we are and what we stood for and what have you. So I told the audience, not particular about what he said, but that he was one of our main supporters, first supporters. And we very well thanked him for what all he did for us. And so the crowd, stood up and gave him a hand, and we had the drums sing him an honor song, and we gave him a star quilt. And boy, he was very, very happy. In fact, he even was able to, if there's such a thing, double his friendship in our behalf. And eventually, until he retired, he was really a true ardent friend after that. But, that's the kind of education that we had to provide him to get him to understand. But I was very happy that he come out and paid us a visit, and our graduates and our audience was able to see him and able to return, some of that gratitude to him. So in the end, it worked out good.
Wow, that's such a remarkable story, and really speaks to as you said, the teacher student. I mean, these folks were your students essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for new tribal college presidents, what advice can you give to help them succeed as leaders?
I guess always be mindful of the tribal college and universities education and historical movement. That is something that is just, it's mind-boggling when you think back about what a handful of really, they didn't have the academic education, but they stepped forward and they looked upon education as the tool to really strengthen their own tribal nation. And they looked to tribal colleges, and particularly at that time, they looked to Navajo Community College, who was the first to get off the ground. And they paid them a visit. And so, we didn't have the accreditation or certification at that time, but we went to different institutions and frankly were turned down by, the first several that we attended. We tried to be satellite centers where we could borrow their certification, but in some it didn't work out. But fortunately, in the case of ourselves at Black Hills State University, they were able to step forward and said, "We'll help you." So we were very appreciative of, what the University of South Dakota did and helped us with our nursing, and Black Hills helped us with our AA degrees until we were able to get on our own feet and stand on our own and have our own accreditation or get our own recognition. So, but it took a while. So that's one thing, that I just always impress upon leaders, that they need to be mindful of the things that our early tribal college leaders went through. And then always be mindful of what's going on around you. Pay attention, whether it's on television or whether it's in the news, that what's going on in Washington, D.C., and what's going on in what's being written in our educational journals. Always do a lot of reading and a lot of listening and see how you fit in as an institution, presently and futuristically. And maybe you need to alter some things a little bit, but always, stay with the foundation of blending the past with the future. And it's always something that, I find myself doing, whatever it is, I'm always thinking, how does this affect us? How do we fit into this? What does this mean for us in the future? What does this mean for us now? And it gives you, I guess, kind of ammunition for thought to see how you develop and design and bring your institution, forward and keep it on track so that you're always within what's going on with that big picture across the country or even, globally sometimes. So they need to always be mindful of and be thinking of, where their institution is and where it fits into this big picture. So it keeps you busy. I guess, I don't know if I mentioned this, but it could have been one of the other challenges, but I mentioned Bob Russell, didn't I?
Yeah, you mentioned him earlier.
Yeah, I mentioned him earlier. Yeah, no, that I guess kind of and just I don't know what you're doing here, Smith. I can't reach it here, but we're at the end anyway, so I don't think that ring will bother us. But somebody must be calling me from college here. But yeah, I want to put in. I'll wait till this phone stops ringing here.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking at the very first issue of Tribal College Journal back in 1989, and the very first article in the very first issue was an article that you wrote, and it was called "Commitment to Community."
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that's kind of where that is our foundation and our motto and our mission. And I guess that's one of the things also that probably sets us apart from our other institutions. They don't. Theirs is kind of almost like a factory. You're putting students out there, graduating them, and preparing them for their own future livelihood. Whereas with ourselves, ours is a bigger base. It's strengthening a tribal nation, and utilizing our graduates and their what they're learning, and it's creating a whole new, tribal agenda in a lot of ways. We have a long way to go yet, but we started out with the, teacher education and counseling and those type things. But what awaits us is now we need to begin to look at courses and degrees that are in the area of land and natural resources and these areas, and start looking at bringing economics into the picture. So these things, await us yet. But it's been a lot of fun and always, something to do, and it's just most appreciative. But the one thing that they need to be mindful of is that you always must be guided by prayer and ceremony. That's one of the things that I always appreciate what John Forkenbach said one time in D.C. He always thanked me for keeping, he said, AHEC on track through prayer and ceremony in Washington. That there was never a time when we deviated from spirituality in our seeking of our legislation. So I always thank them for that. But we still, that's still something that all tribal colleges, I'm sure, continue to do. So I'm appreciative of that. And then always be thankful and appreciative of previous educational leaders, what they did to strengthen, introduce and strengthen, the tribal college. You see people like Jim Shanley and Joe up there in Sage Kootenai. But I thought, I didn't know if you had Janine Pease, but she needs to be interviewed as one of the leaders. We owe so much to her. She was sharp. She was very analytical, and she was a very good speaker. And she worked for many years, I think almost 20 years as president of Little Bighorn. So she certainly needs to be recognized as one of the great leaders of the early travel college movement. But it awaits us too. We need to, these young ones need to be looking at history and ancestry and writing stories about our own families and our own history, doing research, and gathering pictures and gathering stories and writing editorials in local newspapers, both about tribal and non-tribal new developments, partnerships, but always keeping TCUs in the tribal and the public mind, have articles in major newspapers and hearings and recommendations as to strengthening tribal nations and culture, redefining, restructuring education, developing our own tribal accreditation through tribal law, restructuring U.S. Department of Education to include tribal colleges with our own assistant secretary, introducing economic and education by our locally, regionally, and nationally, and even globally. And then we have another mandate, which is really a tough one to address, but it's key to our future if we really want to be who we say we want to be. But at some point, we have to develop an alternative system of tribal government. And that's something that, the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act gave us what we have today. But it's vital that we develop something according to the treaty. And it's something that we want and not who somebody else wants for us. That's a big one that awaits all of us at some point. But I guess, in closing, I certainly want to thank you, Brad, for what you're doing and what you're all doing at the Tribal College Journal. And it's just really, something to see. I was just talking to Gail Bruce earlier, and I remember what we had to go through to create the American Indian College Fund. And it's off and running, and it's doing well, and we've just, been very fortunate, and thank the Creator and thank our spirit world for those who have something to do with tribal colleges in the early days and might be in the spirit world, but we know they continue to help guide us, and we appreciate that. And always thankful. And I always thank Navajo Community College or Dene College for jumping out there and what they did. But also we thank Carlos Montezuma, that famed Apache, who way back in the 19 teens, advocated for a national tribal university at that time. And that's something that I picked up on, and I've always supported and tried to push. Difficult, but one day, it's going to come. I think, maybe something like Pasco could be, a national tribal university, and all of the members of AHIC could all be, satellite programs or, institutions that are tied into it. But this has always been a thinking of AHIC when we created AHIC, that AHIC in some fashion would be some kind of a university of tribal higher education. So these things, challenges still await us. And I think, our young ones who are coming need to be mindful of that, rather than thinking that they're a president of like a mini college IST's short bowl, about the fact that he's located close to Shadron. college guys, so you're not a mini tribal college, like Shattering. You're a president where you need to create a whole new system of a tribal environment, our own accreditation, and whatever else that pertains to ownership by tribes and by tribal people in terms of spirituality and sovereignty. So that's kind of where, TCUs were born with, and that's kind of where I've always tried to point us in that direction and work in that direction. So any help that you give us and continue to give us, we certainly appreciate, Brad. Thank you for directing me and helping me, involving me here to continue with this. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you for all you've done for the tribal college movement, and all the groundwork that you have laid that has gotten us to where we are today. So if it wasn't for you and some of those early leaders, we certainly would be nowhere near where we are. So thank you for that.
Thank you and appreciate it. And you keep warm, and winter's coming, and I've got this lung situation here that I developed when I had pneumonia about 4 years ago, and they say I had a scarring of lung tissue, and it's really affects my breathing.
Yeah.
And this little thing I do that requires energy, I have to kind of stumble along if I can get my wind sometimes. So they got me on oxygen, and well, that's good. It's also kind of a nuisance, because this loss of your wind affects everything. Affects your eating, affects your showering, and affects, you name it. It creates a difficult time trying to breathe, and even affects your hunger, and you're not hungry. And consequently, I've lost 106 pounds this year. So I've reduced, my weight drastically. There was a time in my life I weighed 336.5 pounds. Now I'm down to around 160. So it's almost lost half the size of who I once was, I guess, size-wise. So that's kind of interesting, but we'll appreciate life. And going on 82 years old, and I was 32 years old when I started at the college, and then I'm glad the board with this COVID, which is a tough one. It's taken a lot of our people, but they're allowing me to stay home and work from home. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Good one.
Okay. Well,
you take care of yourselves and do my best to everybody at the TCU staff there, and we'll be in touch somewhere down the line again.
all right.
Keep the paper coming. Appreciate it.
We'll do that. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, President Bordeaux.
You bet.
All right.
Thanks for being invited.
Great.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.